Ethan Cole was 36, a man who blended into the background of a Manhattan finance tower. He wore the kind of clothes that lasted too long, shirts washed thin, shoes polished not for style but for survival. His hands carried the proof of labor, rough and calloused, from years of cleaning floors and fixing what others ignored. Every night he moved quietly through marble hallways and glass offices, his ring of keys granting him entry to rooms where million-dollar deals were made. Yet, to the executives who passed by, he was invisible. His worth was measured only in what he could mop, wipe, or carry. At home in a small apartment in Queens, he lived for his daughter Lucy. She was 7, with a quick wit and eyes that lit up whenever she found broken electronics in the trash bins on their block. She would drag them inside, scatter screws across the kitchen table, and declare she was building robots to save the world. Ethan, exhausted from 10-hour shifts, always found the energy to sit with her. He guided her small hands, taught her which wires to twist, which batteries still held charge. Their creations rarely worked as planned, but Lucy saw them as victories, and Ethan saw her as proof that love could build something stronger than loss. Since her mother's death 3 years earlier, Lucy was his anchor, and every paycheck, every ache in his back, every lonely night was for her. Across the city, Victoria Hale occupied a world of light and glass, where power bent to her presence. At 34, she was the CEO of Hale Tech, a company she had built from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. She was tall, poised, with movements as precise as the lines of her tailored suits. The media called her the Ice Queen, a woman who chose stockholder meetings over family dinners, patents over passion. Cameras captured her as cold, calculating, a leader who never stumbled. Few knew the private truth. Victoria stayed late not just for strategy sessions, but to review the company's childcare support program herself. She carried the scar of a father who once told her she would have to choose, to be loved or respected, never both. So, she chose respect, and built walls of glass around her heart. Then there was Richard Kane, 40, a board member with old money and sharper ambition. He wore silver cufflinks and carried himself like the building belonged to him. To Richard, people like Ethan were nothing more than the help, forgettable and replaceable. To him, Victoria was a temporary obstacle, a woman who had climbed too high and would eventually fall. He thrived on power plays and whispers in dark corners, convinced that money and status gave him the right to decide who mattered and who did not. The janitor, the CEO, the board member. 3 lives set on paths that were never meant to cross. Yet, in a city that thrives on chance encounters and cruel calculations, their worlds were already moving toward each other, pulled by a chain of events none of them could yet see. Soon, the invisible would be seen, the powerful would be tested, and the arrogant would discover that not all strength comes from wealth. Their collision was coming, and when it arrived, nothing inside those glass towers would remain the same. Richard Kane never wasted an opportunity to remind people who held power inside Hale Tech. When whispers about the janitor's lonely life reached him, he decided humiliation would be a convenient game. With a few eager junior executives desperate for his approval, he orchestrated a prank. They built a fake profile of Victoria Hale on a dating app, using photographs lifted from company press releases. Messages were crafted to sound genuine, warm even, and they dangled hope in front of Ethan Cole until he agreed to meet for dinner at the Skyline, a rooftop restaurant where $300 bottles of wine were poured without question. Richard promised his followers a show, the kind that would leave the janitor humiliated and them entertained. Ethan took the invitation as a sign that maybe life was finally offering him something more. He borrowed his younger brother's blazer, slightly loose in the shoulders, and polished his shoes until the leather almost shined. Lucy had insisted on helping him prepare. She told him to ask about favorite dinosaurs, because everyone had one, and she practiced questions with him until he could smile without looking nervous. That evening, Ethan arrived 20 minutes early, ordered only water, and sat at table 12. He checked his phone, adjusted his tie, and turned his glass in small circles. He had no idea that a group at the bar was watching, phones raised, smirks barely hidden behind their drinks. At 08:05 p.m., Victoria Hale stepped into the restaurant, a vision of control in a navy dress and pearl earrings. She had been scheduled to meet investors at another table, but her eyes scanned the room the way they scanned a quarterly report. She noticed the laughter at the bar, the anticipation in the way the junior executives held their phones just so. And then she saw him, the janitor, his blazer slightly too big, his posture hopeful and uncertain. In that instant, she understood the cruelty. She could have walked past, sat with her investors, and ignored the spectacle. Instead, she turned toward Ethan's table. The room stilled as her heels clicked against the marble floor. Ethan stood, startled, murmuring that she didn't have to do this. Victoria pulled out the chair and sat down, her eyes sweeping the bar before lifting his water glass in her hand. Her voice carried across the space, steady and sharp. She said she saw a man who worked nights so his daughter could dream by day. She said the real joke was not the janitor sitting at the table, but the people who thought cruelty was clever. One by one, phones lowered, the smirks faded, and someone dropped a glass and the crash echoed in the silence. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The prank meant to destroy Ethan had turned into a public declaration of dignity. Victoria had chosen to stand with him, and the entire room was forced to see the janitor not as invisible, but as a man worthy of respect. The restaurant slowly returned to its hum, but at table 12 the air felt different. Ethan shifted in his seat, unsure of how to begin, until Victoria leaned forward with a look that told him she expected honesty, not performance. He told her about Lucy, how she was 7 going on 40, convinced that robots built from old fans and wires could make the world better. He admitted that most nights he came home long after midnight, too tired to eat, but still found himself at the kitchen table helping her fit broken parts together. His voice softened when he described how she glowed whenever something she built lit up, even if only for a second. That glow, he said, was worth every ache in his back. Victoria listened, not as a CEO but as a woman unused to hearing someone speak without calculation. She asked about Lucy's school, and Ethan smiled for the first time all evening. He told her about the winter when the heating system broke. The district had no funds, so the kids shivered in their coats until he brought in his tools one night. He stayed past dawn, piecing the furnace back together with little more than borrowed parts and stubbornness. It probably violated a dozen codes, he admitted, but the classrooms were warm by morning. Victoria studied him with fresh eyes. Here was a man dismissed by the world as invisible, yet he carried skills and a quiet discipline that kept others safe. She noticed the way his hands gestured when he explained the repair, steady and precise. He mentioned his small habit of writing down everything he noticed was broken in the tower. Door locks that stuck, lights that flickered, air vents that rattled. He logged it all in reports that nobody read. To him it was routine, just part of the job. But she sensed a mind that saw order where others saw inconvenience. The conversation stretched beyond the meal, flowing with an ease that surprised them both. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen not as a janitor, not as a widower, but as a father and a man who still carried worth. Across from him, Victoria felt something stir she had long buried, a quiet respect and admiration for a man who had no need for titles or power to prove his value. By the time the waiter cleared their plates, The humiliation of earlier had faded into something else entirely. A fragile connection had formed, and though neither said it aloud, both knew this night had changed the way they saw each other. The rooftop dinner became tomorrow's headline, Before Dawn. Photos of Victoria Hale walking with Ethan Cole spread across news sites with captions designed to sting. The Ice Queen dining with a janitor. Within hours, Hale Tech stock dipped 3%. Investors uneasy. And Richard Kane seized his moment. He called for a board meeting, framing it as a concern for leadership stability. Behind closed doors, he whispered about impropriety and judgment lapses, fueling the narrative that Victoria was reckless. Ethan felt the impact in a different way. At Hale Tech, co-workers stared longer than usual, some snickering as he passed. A few called him the janitor who dated the CEO, half mocking, half curious. He kept his head down, polishing floors, changing light bulbs, pretending not to hear. But inside, the humiliation burned. He had spent his life invisible, and now that people noticed him, it was for all the wrong reasons. Victoria refused to retreat. At a press briefing when asked directly about the photos, she spoke calmly. She said she had dinner with an employee. If that was considered scandalous, then the real issue was not her choice, but society's inability to value human dignity. Her words carried weight. But behind her confidence, she knew the storm had only begun. Perhaps sensing Ethan's isolation, she reached out again. This time she suggested a meeting away from reporters and executives, a simple afternoon in Riverside Park. She told him to bring Lucy. Ethan hesitated, but agreed. On Saturday, the park buzzed with families and food trucks. Lucy spotted Victoria first, sitting on a bench in jeans and a sweatshirt, hair pulled into a ponytail. Gone was the polished CEO. She looked almost ordinary. Lucy marched straight up and began telling her about dinosaurs, about how T-Rex parents were probably protective despite their small arms. Victoria listened intently, asked questions, and even laughed. When Lucy showed her a small robot she had built from a computer fan and cardboard, Victoria crouched down, examined it carefully, and told her she had the mind of an inventor. Ethan watched the exchange with cautious wonder. He had never seen Victoria like this, relaxed, smiling, unguarded, and she had never been seen this way either, not in boardrooms, not in the press. For a moment, the world's noise fell away. They were simply a father, a daughter, and a woman who was more than her title. By the time the sun began to set, something unspoken had settled between them. Their connection had begun as a spectacle forced upon them. But it was no longer just that. Through Lucy's bright eyes and unfiltered honesty, Ethan and Victoria found themselves linked in a way neither had expected, drawn together not by scandal but by the possibility of something real. Lucy had been waiting for her chance. She tugged at Ethan's sleeve and pulled a small bundle from her backpack. A robot she had built from a fan, a cereal box, and scraps of wire. She placed it in Victoria's hands with the pride of a scientist unveiling a masterpiece. Victoria turned it carefully, examining the taped joints and the tiny motor. She told Lucy it was remarkable, that she saw real engineering in those small fingers. Lucy beamed, and for the first time Victoria laughed, a laugh that carried no polish, no boardroom caution. It was real. And Ethan noticed how different she looked when the weight of her title slipped away. As Lucy ran off to the swings, Ethan's smile faded into something more solemn. He spoke quietly, almost as if he feared saying the words out loud. He told Victoria about his wife, how the illness had come quickly, how the doctors had given them no real chance. He described the nights he sat beside a hospital bed praying for more time, and the mornings he had to pretend to be strong for a little girl who still set a place for her mother at the table. His voice caught when he admitted that some days he worried Lucy remembered too much, and other days he feared she would forget. Victoria listened without interrupting, her eyes soft in a way the press had never captured. When he finished, she hesitated, then shared her own wound. She told him how her father once said she could be respected or loved, but never both. Those words had guided her life, made her build walls of glass and steel, made her chase achievements while silently wondering if she had traded away something more important. For a moment, neither spoke. The park buzzed with children's laughter, but at the bench, they sat in a quiet pocket of honesty. Two people who had lived very different lives found themselves joined by the same thread of loss and loneliness. Ethan realized the woman across from him was not the cold figure painted by tabloids. She was human, scarred, and searching. Victoria realized the man beside her was not just a janitor. He was a father carrying more strength than most of the men she knew in her world of tailored suits. When Lucy returned, demanding they help push her higher on the swing, Victoria rose without hesitation. Ethan watched as she laughed again, this time under the fading light. The ice that had surrounded her for so long was cracking, and for the first time, Ethan wondered if something new was taking its place. The boardroom was a theater of power. 12 members seated around a table that gleamed under the lights. Richard Kane stood at the center, his voice sharp and deliberate. He said the company could not afford a leader whose judgment was clouded by personal choices. He pointed to the photographs splashed across the press, Victoria Hale on the arm of a janitor. To Richard, it was proof of emotional weakness, a liability that threatened shareholder confidence. A few board members nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, but the pressure was growing. Victoria sat still, her expression unreadable, but inside she felt the noose tighten. Richard was skilled at this, twisting perception into reality, turning whispers into weapons. He pressed for a formal review of her leadership, framing it as a matter of fiduciary duty. The words carried weight in a room where money often outweighed morality. Meanwhile, several floors below, Ethan moved through the silent corridors with his cart. In the executive conference room, he noticed something odd. The trash bin had already been emptied, yet inside the liner were scraps of shredded paper streaked with fresh ink stains. He leaned closer, saw the edges of signatures blurred with solvent. It was nothing he could fully understand, but his instinct told him it was wrong. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone, took photos, and logged it in his maintenance report. It was habit. He recorded what was broken, no matter how small. Upstairs, the boardroom pulsed with tension. Whispers darted from one end of the table to the other as Richard pressed harder, insisting the company needed stability, not scandal. Victoria's allies were quiet, unsure if they could resist the tide. The air was heavy with betrayal and ambition. Richard believed he was on the verge of victory, but outside that room, in a simple act of diligence, Ethan had set in motion something larger than any of them could see. The scandal was about to be eclipsed by a deeper truth waiting to surface. Justice came quietly, but decisively. Richard Kane was forced out, his schemes exposed, and the company chose integrity over corruption. In the weeks that followed, Ethan Cole was offered the role of operations manager, a position that finally matched his skill and dedication. He hesitated, worried it was only because of Victoria, but she assured him it was recognition he had earned long before anyone noticed. For the first time, Ethan could see a future where Lucy had opportunities he had only dreamed of. At HaleTech's annual gala, the transformation was on full display. Lucy, dressed in her favorite blue dress, stood proudly beside her latest robot, explaining its design to anyone who would listen. Victoria took the stage and delivered a keynote about innovation, reminding the audience that true breakthroughs come from seeing value where others see none. Her words carried the weight of lived truth, and those who once whispered against her now applauded with genuine respect. Later that evening, on the terrace where their story had begun, Ethan and Victoria stood together, watching the city lights spread out like stars. Lucy ran up, her small hand slipping into theirs, and asked if they were a family now. Ethan and Victoria looked at each other, smiles soft and unguarded. In that moment, the answer was clear. What had started with cruelty had turned into kindness, and what began as scandal had become something real. Integrity had defeated arrogance, and love had quietly built a foundation strong enough to last.